Hello, my name is Grandin Gill, and I'm a professor at the University of South Florida's Muma College of Business. This is the fourth lecture in a series of lectures about complexity, information technology, and strategic decision making. In this particular lecture, what we're going to look at is information technology and how it affects the individual's decision making. The topics we're going to be focusing on in this lecture are first, the nature of cognitive limits and how information technology impacts them. Then we will look at the role of information technology in our decision making and how it can change the way we make decisions. And then finally, we will take a look at some skills that will be required for the future generation of workers, many of whom will be inseparable from information technology as they conduct their daily activities. Our decision-making in complex contexts is nearly always impacted by the fact that the human brain has certain cognitive limits that cannot be exceeded, and much of what we do in our decision-making involves trying to manage around these limits. In this section, we'll take a look at these limits and some of the implications for decision-making. In the first lecture in this series, we introduced the notion of experienced complexity. Experienced complexity relates to the degree that a task requires considerable attention and focus, and it can be experienced in a number of different ways. It can be experienced as difficulty, it can be experienced as uncertainty, or it can be experienced as ambiguity, where there are different interpretations of the task. The principal driver of experienced complexity is unfamiliarity, because when we are unfamiliar with a task, our cognitive limits of 4 to 7 objects in working memory at once are most apparent. As we repeat a task over and over again, what happens is these cognitive limits become less significant owing to processes referred to as chunking and automation, whereby we take elements of a task and bring them together so they only require one piece of memory and not all of our working memory. In our first lecture, we also introduced the concept of the inverted U-curve that describes our cognitive limits. And essentially, when we are encountering novel tasks, there is a balance that we need to maintain between too little attention, which leads to boredom, and too much attention, which leads to a phenomenon known as information overload, at which point we cease to function effectively. These cognitive limits can change for an individual, but they tend to change very slowly over time. So if we get used to very low attention activities, eventually our curve will shift over to the left, and we will be content with less attention, less novelty. If we're constantly dealing with novel, complex tasks over time, our curve can shift to the right, in which case we are more comfortable handling that type of novelty. But at any given point of time, this curve exists, and what we try to do is we try to conduct our tasks in a way that keep us in this highly effective position as opposed to drifting off to the sides of the curve, both of which lead to substandard performance and, quite honestly, unhappiness on the part of the task performer. So what are some of the activities we engage in when we're experiencing growing experienced complexity in the form of difficulty, uncertainty, and ambiguity? Well, one thing that we try to do is reduce our level of arousal, the psychological term that correlates very closely to attention. Uh, we will employ shortcuts to get through the task more quickly. We'll do task switching and enjoy frequent breaks to the task to try to keep that arousal level within our comfort zone. Another impact of growing experience complexity is we don't experience the sense of mastery as much as we used to. Mastery is a major intrinsic motivator. It's what keeps pianists practicing the piano because ultimately there's great satisfaction in performing a task that you've mastered. As we keep encountering novel tasks and we can lose our motivation for mastery, which again is something that will impact the way we perform the tasks. Another factor is over time we will adjust to whatever baseline we are comfortable with. And so, as we saw in the previous slide, the inverted U-curve is not immutable. It can change, but it's something that changes very slowly. And it also means that as we look across different individuals, you will often see very large differences in the level of arousal that they are comfortable with. And it also tends to encourage a preference for the status quo because any significant changes in the task we perform will require a shifting of that arousal curve. Finally, the volatile experiences that are associated with extrinsic complexity, that is the complexity that the world delivers to us, can make it very hard for individuals to adapt, and instead they'll try to work around with things like these shortcuts we talked about. Because they are not used to the major shifts in attention that this uncertainty requires. It can also produce a resistance to the restructuring of tasks because, once again, that changes the level of experience complexity that you experience as you are performing the task. So, one of the many ways that we can address high experience complexities, and one of the most popular ways today, is to try to offload some or all of the task to information technology. And it is some of the challenges that is produced by that process of offloading intrinsic complexity to information technology that we will look at next. So, what happens when we start to use information technology to aid us in our decision making? Well, it turns out that there are both direct and indirect consequences of this, which we will now explore. Harkening back to our third lecture dealing with information technology, what are some of the ways that information technology can help us as we try to deal with the intrinsic complexity that is the source of our experienced complexity? Well, we can use information technology for sharing information, for example, language processing and communications. We can use it for storing information, both for writing materials and recording materials. We can use it for calculating. We have number systems, arithmetic, calculating machines. We even have tools that are useful for information processing, tools that are capable of doing logic, such as logic programming, mathematical systems, and more recently, neural nets. So there are very, very few aspects of information processing that we could not potentially share with tools. But as we saw in the third lecture, the use of information technology as a side effect changes the environment. So as a consequence, when we use technology, there are a number of direct benefits. It allows us to handle tasks of much greater intrinsic complexity. It reduces the friction in our economic systems. We talked about that in the context of blockchain. It provides us with much greater access to data for our decision making. That's the big data and analytics. And it even allows us to establish communities of common interests, again, social networks. Now, there are costs associated with each of these. When we engage in all these activities, increasing the intrinsic complexity of our tasks, building up connectivity, increasing the speed of decision making, what we do is we potentially dramatically increase the extrinsic complexity of the environment, which is to say the way the environment reacts over time. It also creates the potential for overreaction. We've seen this in the recent coronavirus outbreak, as we discovered that all these interconnections that were allowed by information technology have created huge dependencies on countries like China, and that has meant that supply chains have broken down because we didn't even necessarily realize how significant the interrelationships that we had established were. One of the challenges presented by data is it tends to focus our attention on quantitative past behaviors. We can't gather data from the future, so we have to be content with data from the past. And the types of data that we gather and can process typically are those types of data that can be readily quantified. But there are lots of other sources of insights that are not the result of quantifiable data that we may lose focus on as a result of relying too heavily on technology. We also find that this ability to create communities of common interests makes it particularly easy to create silos and echo chambers where essentially the role of communications is to reinforce a set of shared belief rather than to explore new ideas. Putting all these pieces together, we find ourselves in a process such as the one in the diagram that you're looking at. As we look at information technology is increasing our levels of connectivity. It's increasing the accessibility of data. Technology advances are increasing the range of things that we can accomplish with technology. All of these things appear to be very positive. Now, as they impact the environment, what we're doing is we're increasing the pace of change. We're increasing the size of the fitness landscape, which is to say that we now need to consider elements such as what's going on in cities halfway across the world that we never had to worry about before. We're also increasing the ability to automate different tasks. These factors, in turn, increase extrinsic complexity, the complexity of the environment, because it can operate faster with more interrelationships and with more elements in the system. It also allows us to increase intrinsic complexity. Our systems can handle tasks that are much, much more complicated than they used to be able to handle. And as a result, we can build much, much more complicated systems. The challenge this produces is that when the individual encounters this, there is a very, very good chance that experienced complexity is going to rise. And as we have noted, when experience complexity rises, we need to try to get ourselves back in balance, back in that level of arousal that we're comfortable with. The consequence is that we have a lot of different approaches to this, most of which would be considered negative. We tend to rely very heavily on experts instead of using our own logic to try to figure out what is happening. These experts can be both human and technology-based. We tend to make a lot of decisions by imitation. As I mentioned, on fitness landscapes, what you really want to do is identify a set of self-similar peers, so that you can see what makes them succeed and imitate them. It's often much more viable as an approach than trying to understand the environment. We can also disengage from tasks. Essentially, we can walk away. Over time, we may be able to adapt to high loads, and that is going to be something that will tend to produce levels of difference. Inequality has become a major theme. We can use old heuristics that may or may not work in the current environment that we're looking at, and we can also shorten our time horizons. Obviously, the less far in the future you look, the less of a cognitive load trying to figure out what's going to happen is going to exert. So all of these techniques are likely to be required in order to respond to the increasing experience complexity driven by the environment, and in many respects enabled by our increasing use of technology. To put this in the context of the workforce, today, for the first time in history perhaps, we have 4 generations actively participating in the workforce. The baby boomers, Gen X, the millennials, and what is sometimes being called as Gen Z, who are now just entering the workforce. Now, it's become pretty popular among the baby boomers and Gen X to look at these newer generations and scratch our head and say, why don't they have the same work values that we have? The newer generations, the millennials and Gen Z, respond with phrases like, okay, boomer, as a way of suggesting we don't understand. But I think that a lot of the challenges faced by these newer generations are brought about by this growth in the extrinsic complexity of the environment that has been enabled by information technology. So if you look at the world that these newer generations face, it's very, very different from the world that I faced, for example, as a baby boomer right in the middle of the baby boom pack, born in 1955. For one thing, the potential career paths open to them are much, much less stable than were perceived to be when I was entering the workforce. We're experiencing a much, much greater diversity of relationships. So now you get to do things like make choices regarding your own gender if you're in these generations. Those of us in the baby boom never really considered that as a possibility. We've seen a breakdown in the religious organizations, the formal organizations that helped guide people towards specific paths. We've seen all sorts of shattering of gender and class stereotypes. Now, we think of stereotypes as being something that's very bad, but stereotypes are a way of dealing with experience complexity. It is overwhelming to attempt to look at every new individual and discover everything about them from a blank slate. So essentially, we start with stereotypes as a kind of a shortcut, and then we modify our beliefs about the individuals as we get to know them. Work has become increasingly specialized. So now, as a consequence, when you are doing a job, you have to really think about what specific job activity you want to focus on, and it can be challenging to switch, and there are many, many more choices to today's generation than there were to other generations. Finally, you have this huge collection of informing channels. As a baby boomer, the informing channels that I'm used to were the telephone and dial telephones. Push-button telephones didn't come along until later in the 60s. And by the way, you didn't use that channel a lot because long distance was very expensive and international calling was incredibly expensive. Today, you have multiple channels that rely on the internet. You've got channels like Zoom for video channels. You've got text messaging. You have the phone. You've got email. All of a sudden, the number of choices that this generation has to deal with and has had to deal with from the very point in time where they entered the workforce is much, much higher. So one of the things that we need to expect is that behaviors to reduce the complexity they experience are going to be very, very important for keeping this generation sane. So what are some of the specific ways that we might expect Gen Z and millennials to deal with the high level of experience complexity in our increasingly technology-enabled environments? Well, for one thing, homophily. That is the tendency to seek out self-similar individuals. As I just mentioned, when you have a rugged fitness landscape, what you need to do is you need to identify entities who are very similar to yourself so that it makes sense to look at what they're doing and see if it benefits them, and then if it's likely to benefit you. You know, drawing upon our cookbook analogy, if you were dealing with a cookbook and you were trying to figure out what makes a recipe for cake better, what you might do is explore similar cake recipes that are also in the book and see what they're doing different. And if you can find one you like better, then maybe that's how you'll change your existing recipe. You would not be looking at recipes for shepherd's pie casserole because the rules that make a shepherd's pie better are very unlikely to apply to a cake as well. So the greater the similarity, the better. This is probably one of the reasons that sequels have become so popular. It's very, very hard to figure out what's going to make a movie a hit. But if you do get a hit, then a sequel is as similar as you can possibly get to that original hit, and therefore has a higher likelihood of being successful than a new movie created from scratch. In this world, your peers become your principal informers, so technologies like social networks become very, very important for discovering how to act. Another thing we might see is task switching. Switching tasks is a good way of dealing with excessive arousal on one task. So you would expect to see a lot of multitasking in this generation. You'd also tend to see a lot of job hopping, basically as a way of dealing with the excessive arousal that can be brought about by the complex environment in which we operate. You can see a tendency to enforce orthodoxies. One of the things that you need is that if you're going to be working in self-similar groups, you want to keep those groups as similar as possible. You do not want those groups to become very divergent in their beliefs. And so in a certain sense, we're likely to see the development of packages of beliefs that work together, even if it doesn't necessarily make sense, logical sense for them to work together. But remember, in a highly extrinsically complex environment, you don't try to make logical sense of things. You just look at patterns that work and try to imitate them. And in many cases, we may even try to enforce these by involving the government. We limit our informing channels. It is very, very difficult. It's cognitively disruptive to see information coming in that is entirely inconsistent with your worldview. And so, as a result, you tend to limit your focus towards channels that produce fairly similar amounts of information that can incrementally impact your beliefs and your view of the world, but do not challenge them directly. Finally, you're going to tend to have shorter time horizons. You're not going to be confident in your ability to predict how your actions today are going to impact the future. And so, as a result, you focus on that portion of the future that you feel like you can impact, which is the very short term. This can also lead to a lot of pessimism about the long-term future. And one of the characteristics of this generation is the fact that they are very, very concerned about the long-term future and often feel as if nothing can be done. I would argue that the types of responses we talked about in the previous slide are completely natural responses to high extrinsic complexity. The problem is they don't work very well in a high extrinsic complexity environment. So while they may in the short term reduce experience complexity, they're a bad fit with the kind of turbulent environment that we are seeing, an environment that is enabled by the extensive use of information technology. For example, participating in groups whose norms cannot be violated produces a high level of fragility in the event that you have a discontinuity or disruption in the environment. Searching for right answers is something that never works in a high extrinsic complexity environment. There are very bad answers, those that sit in the valleys, but there are many, many peaks, and many of those peaks exhibit very, very different behaviors. So in one context, a rule like raising price will work very well. In another peak, that same rule being applied will lead to a disaster. It is this strong interaction effect that means that there really aren't right answers. Using an echo chamber as an information source is terrible in such environments, because when such environments change, what you need to do is you need to sense and rethink the environment, and an echo chamber will simply give you information that may be comforting since it is consistent with your existing information, but will be of no use in adapting to that change. Assuming that straightforward causality exists, that the rules that are true in your local environment are going to apply elsewhere, is something else that simply does not work under high extrinsic complexity environments, because rules tend to be localized. And one of the greatest concerns is that predicting past processes into the future will leave you totally vulnerable to disruptions. And the more you rely on those predictions, which are often made with information technology, the more vulnerable you are to the discontinuities that will always occur eventually, but unpredictably, under extrinsic complexity. So when we think about the high extrinsic complexity environments that millennials, Gen Z, and following generations will experience over the course of their careers, the question then becomes, what skills do we need to provide to these new generations in order to help them operate effectively in these environments? So what skills does an individual need in order to cope with a high extrinsic complexity environment? Let me begin with an anecdote. Back about 27 years ago, I was at Florida Atlantic University, and our department went out and interviewed executives, both individually and in focus groups, trying to determine what skills they wanted our students to have. Now, we were an information systems department, and so we were looking for things like programming in BASIC or SQL or the ability to conduct database operations and draw ER diagrams and so forth. Well, no matter how much we prompted that group, we always ended up hearing the same four skills, which were the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to problem solve effectively, the ability to collaborate with others, and the ability to learn. Now, it's kind of humbling because we weren't actually teaching any of those skills. We were teaching a lot of technical skills, and hopefully they learned some of these other skills by osmosis, but we didn't have any formal focus on communications. We didn't have any courses in that area. We didn't have any courses on collaboration, and we weren't even sure how to teach the ability to learn. We were kind of hoping they'd come in with it, a hope that was frequently dashed by experience. About 10 years later, I did a similar study, and the same four skills emerged. So these seem to be the core skills. Well, when I was working on developing these presentations, I went to Google to try to confirm that these were the skills that executives were looking for. What I found was there was plenty of evidence they're looking for these four skills, but there were two other skills that they also mentioned that I had not heard of in the previous series of interviews I've done. One is the ability to think creatively, and the other, which we heard a lot, is resilience, the ability to deal with an environment that can be a little bit distressing and to cope with failure and all these other attributes that fall under the term resilience. And I think this is important because in a high extrinsic complexity environment, creativity is going to be very important because you're never going to be able to keep what you're doing, i.e. the status quo, going for very long. And resilience is absolutely critical because the environment is going to keep throwing curveballs at you, not unlike the coronavirus outbreak that we are currently dealing with, which is forcing us to change all sorts of behaviors. So let's think about each of these skills individually and how the needed skills have changed from what they used to be when I was growing up to what they are today. With respect to communications, in the old days, it was pretty simple. You had oral communications and written communications. Today, the issue of communications is vastly more complicated. You have many, many different channels that you can communicate with. You need to ensure fit with the channel that you're using. For example, students today often communicate via text message, and when they communicate by email, they make it look like a text message. This is going to confound those of us who don't understand what these abbreviations are. You need to think much more about appropriate sharing. In today's world, people are broadcasting every aspect of their life on tools like Facebook. This was simply not possible. It was not possible in my generation. You have to think carefully about the selection of channels. What do you put on Facebook versus what do you put on LinkedIn? What do you communicate by text versus communicate by email? All of these are skills that the new generations absolutely need to have that were not even relevant in the days when people like myself were entering the workforce. How about problem-solving skills? Uh, when I was acquiring my education, most of the problems that I needed to solve had a right answer, and the solutions were algorithmic in nature. If you found the right procedure for analyzing the problem, then you came up with the right answer. They were also very reductive and causal, which is to say, I was taught to learn to understand what factors cause particular effects, with the assumption that these factors would cause such effects generally as opposed to only very locally. Stated another way, I was trained on decomposable problems. In today's generation, operating with a high extrinsic complexity landscape, it becomes much more important to be able to experiment and design experiments so that you can better understand the local fitness region where you're operating. Data sourcing has become very important because we have lots and lots of sources of data today that were simply not available when I was entering the workforce. You have a much bigger trade-off between search and knowledge. During the period when I grew up, knowledge was considered what you needed, and you used knowledge to generate new knowledge, but we weren't really given that much emphasis on searching. Today, with all the data sources and all the different tools available, understanding how to search and when to use search as opposed to knowledge has become absolutely critical. Finally, we don't look for right answers today. We look for answers that are high fitness and recognize that there may be other fitness peaks where a very different set of rules exists. So the nature of problem solving has fundamentally changed, even though the skill itself remains critical. The nature of collaboration has also changed in today's environment. Collaboration in the old days involved working in local groups, mainly face-to-face, sometimes over the phone, and learning how to break up tasks so that each member of the group got a different piece of it. Essentially, what you're doing there is you're decomposing the task into its pieces, which works a lot better in a decomposable environment than it does in a rugged environment. Today, collaboration involves sharing with all manner of different types of technology. It involves benefiting from the diversity of the group. We've become much more concerned with the diversity of the workforce and accommodating the different perspectives of different diverse groups. And figuring out how to collaborate when the folks you're collaborating with are separated by distance and time. If you look at the information technology industry, for example, a lot of the routine systems development work being done in the U.S. is actually being offshored to places like India, where we're dealing with issues of a different culture, a different time period, and a huge amount of distance. And as we're seeing in the most recent outbreak, these channels can be changed. It's no longer possible to take a flight over there during this particular period, and it is very complex managing these types of collaborations, something that I never had to worry about. What constitutes the ability to learn has also changed. When I was going to school, you were expected to learn in the classroom, you were expected to learn from books, and you could acquire knowledge from mentors and even occasionally coworkers. Today, the ability to learn includes self-directed learning on demand, where you go to YouTube or other sources on the internet and figure out what you need to do. You have to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate sources for learning. Does it make sense to learn about something in Wikipedia, or does that not make sense? And what you may discover is that for some types of knowledge it does make sense, and for some types of knowledge, such as insights into political events, it probably makes no sense at all. We have to learn from experiments in a way that I never had to, because there weren't any there wasn't any conception that the rules could be very, very different in different contexts, whereas today that is very much the case. And so learning through experiments and learning how to design experiments becomes very important in today's world if we're going to adapt to this high complexity environment. Creativity is one of those skills that really didn't come up when I was interviewing executives 25 years ago. I think part of the reason for that was when we were talking about preparing people for the workforce, the view was that when you entered your first job, you wouldn't really need it. So it was something that you could worry about later. I mean, creativity has always been valued, but not necessarily as an entry-level skill. In addition, creativity was only needed in some jobs. My first real job after college was as the reactor controls officer on a nuclear submarine. The last thing they wanted was for me to be creative. Indeed, if I had been creative, I certainly could have threatened the nation and possibly the world's environment, because a nuclear reactor is something you do not want to play around with, especially if you don't fully understand it, which was the case for me. There are fewer and fewer of that type of job left. Today, it's more likely that we will find jobs where creativity can be a huge plus. We need to be able to react to this changing environment, and there's very rarely a script for doing that. We need to find resources. Again, stable relationships between organizations and between individuals are much less common. Again, we also need to devise experiments. We need to think about how we can find the information we need in ways that have not been tried before. All of these skills are now beneficial for many jobs, even at the entry level. Finally, there's the skill of resiliency. Again, a skill that really wasn't emphasized 25 years ago. Part of the reason for this is in the old days, to begin with, it was kind of assumed that you were resilient. Not necessarily a good assumption, but for the most part, your resilience had never really been tested in an environment that was much more stable. In addition, the need for resilience was offset by the routineness associated with many jobs, and as a consequence, it was not something you worried about that much for entry-level employees. Today, resiliency becomes much, much more important. The high arousal levels associated with today's environment demand a certain level of resilience. You need to be able to recover from the shocks that you're likely to experience in the systems. Resilience is important in avoiding disengagement with the workforce. One of the big concerns is if you experience arousal levels that are too high, you will simply walk away. And it's very expensive for employers to have employees walking away. Finally, resiliency is a critical part of being able to adapt to change, and organizations are increasingly requiring their employees to adapt to change, something that has become clear, crystal clear in the recent outbreak, where the nature of many people's jobs have changed over the course of a week. To conclude, then, the environment in which we do our strategic decision-making has changed dramatically over the past decades, and information technology has been a major factor in enabling those changes. In the broadest sense, the skills that we need to be effective in the workforce, particularly when we first enter the workforce, have changed significantly over the past decades. In the old days, we viewed these skills as four separate skills: communications, problem solving, collaboration, and the ability to learn. And if you had all these independent skills, you could be very effective in the workforce of those days. In today's workforce, the high extrinsic complexity of the environment we face has added some new skills, creativity and resilience, but it has also made the existing skills much more interconnected. And we need to have not only these individual skills, but we need to have them functioning well together if we are going to be effective in today's environment. Thank you very much for watching this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email address is grandon@usf.edu. That is GRANDON @usf.edu.